think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, good morning, or good morning here. I don't know where everyone else is. Good morning, good day, good evening. My name is Stephanie Hagstrom, and I'm the Director of Community Development at the Research Data Alliance US. Today's webinar is part of the 2021 webinar series hosted by the RDA US, highlighting the Research Data Alliances group outputs. Give you a little bit background about RDA and then we'll get going. The Research Data Alliance is a community of over 11,900 data experts from 145 countries. You see the countries on the slide, who collaborate together in building the social and technical bridges to enable open sharing and reuse of data. The members of the RDA come together through self-formed, focused working groups and exploratory interest groups to exchange knowledge, share discoveries, discuss barriers, potential solutions. They also define policies and test standards. Many of the 97 current active groups, such as the group presenting today, have produced outputs to enhance and facilitate global data sharing and reuse. The RDA also has 26 plus national groups that support initiatives of the members of those regions and provide a platform for those regions to interact on a global level. There are also 4 regional groups of the RDA that provide resources to support the RDA global operations. The RDA US is one of those recognized regions and is represented by 2,500 members who also help strengthen the data science infrastructure community. So before we get started into the webinar, I'm going to go over a couple little housekeeping things, and then we have a quick poll, and then we'll get started. I want to go over, let's see, we will be recording this presentation. I think you all saw that, and adding a link to the recording on the RDI website after the event. There's also will be slides, and I will upload those to the same location. We have allotted time at the end of the webinar for Q&A, and when asking the questions, we ask that you please enter those into the Q&A area of your Zoom. That will be easier for us. If you do put it in chat, we will grab it. If there are more questions than the available time, we will transfer those unanswered questions. I'll get answers and I will email them to all of you. So, as I mentioned before, today's webinar is hosted by the RDA US and is the 5th in the webinar series, highlighting RDA group recommendations and outputs. Today, we will hear from the RDA Interoperable Descriptions and Observable Property Terminology Work Group, I-Adopt for short, who will be presenting a webinar titled Decomposing Observable Property Descriptions into Machine-Readable Components. It's a mouthful. Before I hand it off to the group, we would like to get a general idea of who is in the audience. So we're going to launch a quick poll, if you wouldn't mind just filling it out, and that will give us some information as we're moving along. And let us know what your primary role is. So let's see. Okay. Somebody let me know in chat if they see that. Oh, it's being answered, so yes. Data scientist. Can't end it. Okay. It's a couple more, and then I'll close it up. All right. So it looks to me like 32% are data scientists, 14% semantic modelers, 32% data managers, 11% domain scientists, 21% project managers, and 18% other. Okay, well, thank you so much. That. All right. So thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to participate today. We really appreciate it. And at this time, I will turn it over to Maria, who will introduce presenters. So let me move the slide for you, Maria, and I will turn off my camera. You there?
All right, thanks, Stephanie. And thanks to the RDA US for hosting this webinar series on RDA group outputs. I would like to start off by introducing you to our working group members, all of whom contributed to the final output that we will discuss with you today. First, I will introduce our 4 working group chairs. Barbara is a landscape ecologist specialized in GIS and database management with an interest in ontology engineering and terminology governance. Gwen, who unfortunately cannot be here with us today, is a biological oceanographer, and she leads the team responsible for managing the NERC vocabulary server and holds an interest in cross-domain interoperability. Anu, who is also not with us today, is a senior data innovation manager. She has conceptualized and led the development of several practical solutions in earth and environmental sciences, which have resulted in enhanced data management and discovery. My name is Maria, and I work in ontology development and knowledge reasoning and representation as applied to the physical sciences. I spend a majority of my time developing the scientific variables ontology. I would also like to acknowledge our core group members who devote time not just to attend meetings, but also to provide feedback and contribute to content creation. Here at the top of this slide, I have highlighted the 2 group members who will be presenting today. Allison is an environmental data scientist who works on the climate and forecasting metadata conventions, which are widely used for data sharing in atmospheric and climate science. Sirko is a data scientist working to make data understandable and to enable reuse across institutional and domain borders. We also would like to acknowledge our regular meeting attendees who have guided us by providing valuable feedback in the development process. While our presenters are speaking, please add your questions to the Q&A section. And if you want to address them to a specific speaker, please include that in your question as well. And we will have time for about 12 minutes at the end for a Q&A. I would now like to hand the digital floor over to Allison, who will introduce the I-Adopt Working Group.
Hey, thank you, Maria. I'll just share my screen. So I hope you can all see that okay. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Nice to be here. So I'll just spend 5 or 6 minutes introducing the group and the work that we're doing. So all of our work is aimed at addressing the I in the FAIR data principles. So yes, that's in our name, interoperable descriptions of observable property terminologies. And by this, we mean the terms that are used to label and describe scientific variables. So sometimes people refer to these as parameter names, traits, observation types, and so on. But essentially, we mean the thing that is being observed or measured or derived, and that researchers are going to do their work on and publish results about. So the main thrust of our work has been to develop a conceptual framework to support interoperability of these terminologies. And in doing so, we've taken account of use cases and how people are currently using the terminologies, importantly as well, how they would like to use them in the future. So for example, searching for all the data relevant to a particular scientific question, or labeling data with terms from different vocabularies and terminologies. And secondly, we want to promote the use of FAIR terminologies to annotate research data with well-identified, unambiguous, and importantly, machine-readable vocabularies. Part of that process is to identify what we mean by a FAIR vocabulary. The European FAIR's FAIR project has published a set of recommendations for what constitutes FAIR semantics. And in our group, we've looked at how that might be applied to variable terminologies. So although the lifespan of an RDA working group is usually 18 months. Some members of this group have been working together for a much longer period. I-Adopt as a distinct group really originated in 2018 when it was first created as a task group under the umbrella of VISIG, which is the Vocabulary and Semantic Services Interest Group, which is still active within RDA. The work addressed by I-Adopt was seen as being very important for bringing together data services across different scientific communities. For example, in projects such as ENVRI, which is a collection of European environmental research infrastructures, which handle diverse types of data, such as biodiversity, ecology, and hydrology. And similarly, in the UK, a lot of work has been happening to harmonise access to data from the NERC data centres that serve various parts of the environmental science community. So that would cover things like atmospheric science, ocean science, polar science, geology, and so on. So from its beginnings in 2018, the group has continued to meet regularly, and it has grown as an activity, and it became an official RDA working group at around the time of the 14th plenary meeting. And since then, we've had regular meetings, and the group has held breakout sessions at all the subsequent plenaries, including the most recent one in Glasgow. And that's been really helpful in advertising the work of the group to beyond just its core members and promoting wider discussion. And the feedback from that has really helped us to take the work forwards. So this slide shows that the work of the group has been organised into a series of tasks starting in November 2019 and coming forward to the present. There are really two main points about this. The first is that during the first half of the work plan, we spent time looking at existing terminologies that are in use in the environmental sciences and gathering user stories on how people are using those terminologies. So what we're doing is very much based on current practice, what people are actually doing, and we want to enhance and extend that. So we're not in any way trying to compete or replace existing terminologies with our work. And the second point is that the lifetime of the group has actually been extended now for another 6 months. So we have an extension until October of this year, and during that additional period, we're working on testing the interoperability framework that we have created, and you'll see some examples of that. Going to my next slide. So it's important to say that there are, and probably a lot of you will already be familiar with the fact that there are existing semantic models for observations. And our work fits in very well with these existing models, and it extends them. So again, we're not seeking to replace existing semantic models, rather to strengthen them. And our work fits in quite naturally because variables are used in many different semantic models. They're not necessarily specified in a uniform or consistent way across those models, and often they're not in a machine-readable way. And I have just a couple of examples on this slide. So the O and M, which is the OGC Observations and Measurement Model, is on the left-hand side, and the SOSA SSN model on the right-hand side both represent models for observations. So it's not necessary to go into all of the details here, but we can see that both models contain components referring to the act of making an observation. So for example, which sensor was used, what platform it was on, and so on, as well as having concepts in there for things like feature of interest and observed property, which is really where the work of I-Adopt comes in. So for example, you might observe the height of a tree, and the tree would be an object of interest and the height would be the observed property. But the way that these existing models break down the observable property can be extended, and that is where our work comes in. And there's just another example here. So this is from schema.org, which some of you may be familiar with. And this has a property called variable measured, which can be applied to data sets that in turn can describe the variables with property value combinations or free-form text. But the way you actually specify the variable is not really very closely tied down. So what's really important to state at the beginning is that our concept of variable in I-Adopt is that we are concentrating on what is observed, the thing that you actually observe or measure or calculate in your model, not focusing on the where, the how, the when, and so on, because that's already covered in the existing semantic models. And the purpose of our interoperability framework is to capture the necessary elements to fully and unambiguously specify a variable in a discipline neutral way. So initially we've been focusing on the environmental sciences because that's where a lot of our group members are drawn from, but we think that there's potential to apply this framework more widely. So now I'm going to hand over to Maria next, and she will review the existing conceptual models and domain level ontologies that have influenced the development of the I-Adopt framework.
Great, thank you so much, Allison. All right, I hope everyone can see my screen okay. So I will talk about current top-level domain independent ontologies, as well as conceptual models for variables that influenced the creation of the I-Adopt framework. First, I'm going to go over the inventory of current top-level ontologies that we looked at. And we found that these top-level ontologies, in general, are used to define hierarchical or taxonomic categorization of entities in the world that might be of interest to variable representation. And these serve as a foundation for many current domain ontologies and thus provide a common framework for communicating about entity types across domains. Here I'll review the three most popular such ontologies, which are the basic formal ontology or BFO, descriptive ontology for linguistic and cognitive engineering, DLCE, and the suggested upper merged ontology or SUMO. But I do acknowledge that there are other successor upper ontologies, such as the unified foundational ontology that exist. We just don't have time to cover everything here. And the specifics of categorizations of entities and their location in the hierarchy may vary across ontological viewpoints, but there are three primary categories that emerge across all these ontologies, as you'll see. First, there is BFO, which is the basis of numerous ontologies in the sciences, among them the environment ontology and the food ontology. And this is a three-dimensional oriented ontology with the primary classes of continuant and occurrent, where continuant includes independent continuants such as material entities and objects, and it also includes dependent continuants such as qualities and roles that inhere in or are possessed by independent continuants. Occurrents, on the other hand, are processes in temporal regions and entities that occur in time. Next, we have DLCE, which is an ontology of particulars, and it is divided into four primary categories, those of endurant, perdurant, quality, and abstract, where endurant includes physical objects, features, amounts of matter, and perdurant include events, states, and processes, and qualities include physical, temporal, and abstract qualities. And lastly, abstract. The abstract class includes time intervals and space regions. So you can already see an overlap between concepts represented in DLCE and those represented in BFO. Lastly, we have SUMO, which was developed by an IEEE working group. And on their website, they say it is the largest free formal ontology available. It categorizes all entities into two primary classes. It's by far the most straightforward and compact top-level ontology, and it includes the category of physical and the category of abstract, where physical entities include objects and processes, and abstract entities include quantities and attributes. And so what we see across all of these top-level ontologies is that they mainly divide the world into three types of entities related to scientific variables. And those are first, independent continuance or endurance, which include things like objects, material entities, substances, etc. There are also dependent continuants, such as qualities, attributes, whatever other terminologies they might have for these, but these are entities that are that inhere in independent continuance. And then additionally, we also have perdurance occurrence processes, which address entities that occur in time. And in general, in these ontologies, qualities or properties, or whatever the label for them is, are represented as something like quality of an object inheres in an object, which it tends to make faceted searching and adding new terms to these types of ontologies a bit complex. And so this is what we're trying to target with developing this atomistic representation approach, faceted approach to variable representation. Next, I'm going to go over the inventory of current semantic models for representing variables. And I'm going to look specifically at two models that aim to atomize components of a variable. And both demonstrate the need and usefulness of decomposing facets of a variable for interoperability. One of them was developed from the perspective of observation and measurement. This one's called Complex Property Model, or CPM. And the second was developed from the perspective of modeling and simulation. This is the Scientific Variables Ontology, or SVO. So first I'm going to review CPM, which was developed to expand the observed property and feature of interest components of O&M that Allison mentioned previously. And as you can see here in the diagram of CPM, we have the central component, which is the observable property. And this would point to a phenomenon such as one that might be indexed in a code list or a standard name list, such as the CF standard names. And this observable property can be decomposed into an object of interest, which might be the substance, taxon, or other physical chemical phenomenon of the feature of interest that is being observed. And in addition to that, there's also the property, which is defined as the property of the environment, which the observable property is describing. Furthermore, the observable property can be defined by a matrix, which is a special case of a feature of interest that provides the context, whether container, feature, or medium, for an observable property, as well as adding constraints, which are just a generic way of providing further limitations to the observable property. And here I'm just showing a table of how you would take, these are just examples from the BODC parameter usage vocabulary. And it just shows how you would use the CPM model to decompose certain variables into their component parts according to CPM. Lastly, I'm going to review the Scientific Variables Ontology, or SVO. And this ontology was created to enable principled machine creation, detection, and alignment of components of a scientific variable that might be expressed either as free-form text or as a standard name. And it was created within the context of scientific modeling to perform tasks such as aligning data to scientific model inputs and model inputs to model outputs. The central component of SVO is a variable, which is similar in idea to the observable property of CPM. And variable here is defined as a pairing of a phenomenon with a property, where there are very general definitions for phenomenon and property. Phenomenon is something that is or can be observed to happen or exist, and a property is a quality or characteristic of a phenomenon. And furthermore, a variable can be tagged with a reference, which is a phenomenon property value that can provide a spatial or temporal reference for the evaluation of a variable, such as, for example, if we have the height of something above sea level, that would be a reference. So in SVO, in order to define more specific phenomena, we also allow for the addition of an attribute to a phenomenon, which is essentially a property value pair that can be used to create a narrower phenomenon. And in addition to that, phenomena are recursively defined in terms of other phenomena and their roles from the observer perspective, and are identified using modular patterns. And here the diagram shows how a phenomenon may be split up into its participants, each one being assigned a role, and the process in which they might participate, as well as adding a context with another phenomenon. In addition to that, SVO allows for phenomenon to be attached, not just as spatiotemporal context, but also to include additional participants when you have more complex properties, such as mass concentration, that require the identification of multiple phenomena, each with their own, that play their own role within that property. And here's just a quick diagram of how a variable is, again, decomposed into a property and phenomenon, and the phenomenon is further decomposed into its component phenomena and processes and roles for phenomena. So in summary, from these current semantic models, what we see is that what they share in common is that they both identify two core components, some kind of object of interest that would be identified as an independent, continuant, endurant, etc. in a top-level ontology, and a corresponding property, which is usually called the dependent, continuant, or quality, etc. in a top-level ontology. And in addition to that, the description may optionally include further restrictions on the object of interest in the form of a constrained attribute or other, as well as additional context objects such as matrix, medium, or other. Now I'm going to hand it off to Serko, who's going to do an overview of the finalized I-Adopt framework.
Thanks, Maria. And I'll try to share my screen now, which you hopefully can see now. Okay, so it's up to me now to explain you a little bit about the current result of our working group. And I'll do that with this running example here. So we have a variable which should describe the concentration of endosulfan sulfate in wet flesh of Ostrea edulis. So Ostrea edulis is pretty much an oyster, as you can see on the right-hand side, at least if Wikipedia doesn't betray myself. And endosulfan is an insecticide which has been banned in most parts of the world, but is still prevalent in, for example, those oysters. So now going on with the framework, our main concept is called variable and should encompass everything that's somehow related to that observation. So in this case here, it really contains all the description that we've seen before. And then we are going on with decomposing that. So the first piece that we would like to address individually is the object of interest. So in this case, we are measuring something about endosulfan sulfate. So in our case here, this would be the object of interest. Next thing is the property or characteristic that we are measuring. We're calling this here really property, but other ontologies calling it characteristics, quality, kind, etc. And for the example, here this is just the concentration. And those two properties are actually the bare minimum that you have to describe about your variable. You have to describe what you're measuring and at which place or on which object you're measuring that. But on occasion, you want to describe much more about it, some more context. And the first piece of context that we think is useful is the so-called matrix, which is kind of the material context or the embedding of whatever you're measuring. So going back to the example, we are not measuring the endosulfan anywhere, but just in the flesh part of this oyster. Next thing is then a more general context, which we call here context object, which allows you to attach more background information. So in case you need to attach anything more that has some meaning for this observation, the context object is the place to go. We left this particularly open, as the scope of what is considered important for a particular measurement cannot be predetermined, but is really dependent on your particular measurement and what you think is relevant. In our example here, the specific species name of our oyster would be a context object. And what you can also see here is that the matrix is only a specialization of the context object. So we thought it might be useful to really separate those two, but in a broader scope, those could be, or those are quite related, and maybe the boundary is not always clear. Next thing then is we have subsumed all these context object matrices and object of interest into entities, which is pretty much anything that has some importance for your measurement or your observation. So in our example case, we have 3 parts here: the endosulfan sulfate we mentioned before as the object of interest, the flesh as the matrix, and the oyster as a context object. If you look at the example, we still have one more missing piece of information that we would like to model. And for this piece, we now introduce to your particular measurement. So in the example here, we are talking about the wet flash rate and not anything else. In other contexts, you might want to discuss that you are doing your observation in a specific height over ground or something else, or at a specific temperature. Right. So this is currently our core model. Something that you will immediately spot is that other things like method or the actual unit of measurement used are outside of scope of the variable. Those would be required to describe the observation, so they should be part of your overall metadata, but it's not part, or we do not consider it part of the variable. In the next step, then we took this model, or this more conceptual model, and put it inside an ontology, which has seen just one small shift. So the object, or the objects you saw in the middle before, object of interest, matrix, and context object, now are only roles of a more general class entity, but the remainder here stays the same as before. What you can also see here on the left-hand side is a screenshot. So we have published the ontology. You can access it, comment on it, and just let us know about your feedback. And with that, I will hand over to Barbara, who will give you some more examples to explain the framework and how it can be applied.
Thank you very much, Seko. So I will now share my screen. I hope you can see it. Okay, so thank you very much, Seko, for introducing the framework and the ontology. Here again, I use the same running example, the concentration of endosulfan sulfate in Ostrea edolis flesh expressed per unit wet weight, which can be generalized as a variable for concentration of substance in biota. And again here, how we modeled it, the property is the concentration of a substance, in this case the endosulfan sulfate, and this constitutes then the object of interest and not the Ostrea edolis, the species, because we look at the property of a substance here. And the substance is measured within the matrix, the flesh of this species. And this flash must be wet and not a dry dried flash. And therefore, wet is the constraint for the matrix. And the context information context object is about the species itself. All these context object metrics and object of interest are entities, as already Seko pointed out. And you can see this, how it is then modeled in the ontology. You see the same example, and you see that all these components like flash ostrea, edulis, and endosulfan sulfate are entities, but having different roles described via these associations. And this example comes from BUDC, and their variable is called the parameter, and this is a quantitative example. As you see here in the small graph, you see that normally this information is stored in tables very often, and the variables are listed or in the header of the columns. And the units are in the second, very often in the second row, whereas the numeric values populate the matrix of the table. Here you see the same example again, but where we are using really cost concepts for all the variable components. And these cost concepts in this case come from the NERC vocabularies, but also from the Pato ontology and from Worms. Here you see how you can apply, you can use this example by representing it in a sheet where you can address each of the components in separate cells. Yes, you see here the variable that has a property and has an object of interest, and the constraint that constrains the matrix and the context object. And you can see in light green a more generalized description of the same variable, the category of the variable where you would not use any constraints, and you would generalize the object of interest and the matrix in this case, so concentration, substance instead of endosulfan sulfate, and biomass instead of flash. Why this might be interesting to really reuse in different contexts and group the descriptions of similar variables, also in a SCOS vocabulary. Here you see a possible extension. So in purple, you see the components of the I-Adopt framework, but in orange, yellow-orange, you see possible extensions. So these are not extensions of the I-Adopt framework, but possible additional metadata about the measurement that are stored together with the data. With this concept, it is also with this approach, it is possible to address these two in a table. Here you see an example of a real use case I'm working on. We want to provide semantic descriptions of column headers of data tables to calculate the emissions of nitrogen and phosphorus to the surface water with the Moneris model. In this case, I'm looking at the variable soil loss in the data table. This one here, you see here lots of information, lots of numeric values stored for many different parameters or variables, and we want to describe these headers here. And in this case, we are looking at the soil loss from less than 1% slope of arable land. And here you see also the unit. So Sorry, one moment. Yeah, so this is the cell we are looking at, and this is the description table for each of the variables. And I'm looking at line 13, just to make you aware. So what we are doing here, so this is a description of one variable with all the decomposition in machine-readable components. And this is how it looks then, like, and you will then, you can see that these are underlined, they have a link included here to the real concepts from SCOS vocabularies. And here you see again how, where these concepts come from. They come from QDT, for example, for this quantity property, mass per area per time. So what it is about, the variable is about the soil loss from arable land with less than 1% slope in a river catchment. And the property here is mass per area per time. And the entity is the entity having the object of interest role is soil erosion, which I took from ENFDES. The constraint is slope less than 1%. Here there is still the need to define, to mint a concept, but will be done very soon in ENFDES for this use case. And the matrix would be the arable land, and we take this concept from ENVO, and the context object is the river catchment, and therefore already a concept exists also in ENFDES, but in many other SCOS vocabularies that would then exactly match to this concept. So I take a third example, and this comes from LifeWatch. This is, they call it trait, so a characteristic of an organism. And this example is a qualitative example. So it's about the shape of a cell. And for qualitative example, this is not about numeric values, but qualitative result values like sphere in this case. So the variable again would be in data tables would be found on the header, and the values in the matrix, but these values are terms, but these terms in this case are not free text, but are coming from existing controlled vocabularies. The vocabulary we use here is from the LifeWatch ontology or LifeWatch SCOS vocabularies. Yeah, you can see how this is used. In this case, we don't use any unit of interest, any unit, but for qualitative information, you just have these concepts, which are the specialists or the specialization for a controlled list. And so the controlled list is shape, and an example would be the sphere. The property here would be a more generalized property than the variable itself. So it is the shape in a more general way. So it's a morphological quality, whereas the shape of a cell used in LifeWatch is really addressing the cell shape. And the object of interest is here pointing to a cell. You see here the descriptions and also the definitions, which are really important to be included in this, the human readable descriptions to be included in the semantic description. So thank you very much for your attention. Please check out our resources. We have a wiki page at the RDA webpage, and we have a framework documentation also there. As Sirko pointed out, we have also published an ontology, And we have also the first paper, a preprint of this paper, and we store all our information in GitHub too, where you can also comment, and where we invite you to bring your input and collaborate with us. So you can still join the I-Adopt community. We would be happy to discuss with you and to see you in our regular meetings. Thank you very much. I will now pass over to Stephanie again.
Stephanie, your audio is off.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. We will now go into Q&A, and Maria, if you could check the chat, and I'll be checking the Q&A. I see, I think you may have just answered that, but Barbara, I think this one's directed at you. How does your description of variables differ from the object model for describing variables in the DDI, CDI specifications?
Well, actually, I am working together with the DDI, CDI team, and we will have to find this out more precisely. They have different levels of concretizations, what a variable is. I think we will need 1 or 2 weeks to really get to a definitive answer, but this is something that we will work out in more detail and also publish soon.
Okay. So Melissa Cuthill asks, will the slides be available? Yes, they will. We will be posting them on the RDA webinar webpage, probably by the end of the day today. Maria, do you have any, are there any?
No, the only question was briefly answered by Barbara, but we can try to go into it more if anyone still has a question. There was a question about, for the first example, why was the endosulfane the object of interest and not the oyster? I don't know if we can go back to that slide.
Which one was it? What number was it? Do you know?
I can check one moment. It's 45.
That one?
Yes. So I think the object of interest is very easy to detect. I think others are a bit more difficult, but the property is really bound. So it's a property, it's a characteristic of the object of interest. So the concentration cannot be the property of Ostrea edulis in this case. It might be more difficult to distinguish between the matrix and the context object, but also here we have quite good guidance that the matrix is really the surrounding material where the object of interest is embedded. And we will for sure come in the next, so we are working on recommendations how to apply the I-Adopt framework by working out many different variables. And we are pointing out to different examples and how this would be treated.
Stephen has his hand up in the chat, and I will allow him to talk and ask a question, I'm assuming. Yep.
We're good. Looking at this example that we have on the screen here, it seems to me, I mean, another way to think about this would be that in terms of the samples, right? That we have samples here, and that we have a sample of an oyster, and that has some context, which is the physical environment where it's collected. The actual analysis was done on a subsample tissue from that oyster. And it seems like another way this could be represented is by saying, well, the analysis is on, the feature of interest, the proximate feature of interest for the actual analysis is the tissue. And that tissue is, has a parent relationship to the oyster, and that oyster has a bunch of environmental context, which is also important. and that for the analysis, that the tissue might actually have wet tissue versus dry tissue as different kinds of subsamples that you might derive from an oyster. So that would, end up, you'd have a sort of, the variable then is concentration of whatever it is, sulfate. And the target, the feature of interest would be the tissue from an oyster.
That would be the matrix. The matrix would be the tissue. Yeah, because that's the embedding.
So in a sample perspective, then that the matrix would be your approximate sampling feature.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I sort of map it into the SSN kind of thinking.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen.
And I think it depends really, sorry if I can extend this, it depends really on your needs and your preciseness, or your need to be precise. So it depends really on the context. So you can expand this description as much as you need it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Okay, the next question is from Joaquim, and is there any alignment of I-Adopt with Darwin Core, GBIF et al? And I'm not sure who he was
GBIF?
directed. Yep.
Darwin Core GBIF. Well, we are working on the mappings in the next 2 months. So we are working on 2 issues. We are working on recommendations and on mappings. But so far we were very busy. Defining all our concepts and the ontology. Although everything what we have done here is built on existing solutions, now we have to point out how this is mapped to existing other representations. Any other who wants to say something here? Fico or Maria?
I think you said it already. So we are currently in the process of mapping to other models like the ones you saw before. So I think Darwin Core and GBIF will also be on the list.
Great, thank you. Tom has asked, has RDA drafted roadmaps to eventually gain acceptance by government agencies, e.g. US EPA et al., so that regulated sampling data could become fairer as well? Who wants to take that one?
Should I try? So I think we are all involved in many different institutions, networks, and we also try to present this work, for example, to EOSC, but here you are talking about US EPA, so we rely on our colleagues in the US, like Maria, but also others from the US LTR network to support this work and to present it at this level. So hopefully you gain more interest. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Maria, there's stuff in the chat. I'm not looking at that. Is there anything there?
I think everything has been addressed there.
Okay.
Do we have a minute to share our quick poll?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes left.
All right, great. So we do have a poll for everyone just to kind of get a sense for how easy you think it might be to use or adopt this framework. And so I'm going to just put a link into the chat for that. And if you have if you have a few minutes to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. We don't have to wait for the responses, Stephanie, if you wanted to.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you. Okay, well, I'd like to thank the presenters today. It was a great presentation. Thank you all. And Megan for helping with the webinar, and the audience for all your questions and contributions. I want to bring up a couple of items to mark your calendar in the future. The RDA US will be hosting 2 webinars in August. One is the Fair Island Project on August 26th. And there will also be a joint ESIP RDA physical samples webinar titled RRIDs, a way to track samples through scientific literature, on August 10th.
Sorry, you are not sharing your screen. You know
Oh,
that.
I didn't know that. Sorry, hold on. Let me go do that. I guess I stopped it when you were talking. Screen 1. Share screen. Do you see it now? Yep. Okay. Let me get back. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So secondly, there will be the 18th Research Data Alliance virtual plenary meeting, which will be November 3rd through the 18th. And I wanted to bring to your attention the call for sessions are now open, and they close on August 6th. And lastly, if you're not already a member of RDA, we encourage you to please join, become part of this vibrant community. And of course, the I-Adopt group would love your help. You can learn how to get more involved by visiting the RDA website. And then that's it. On behalf of the RDA US, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.